We're going to keep the movement moving on here. Obviously, a lot of elements still flowing from what we have seen with the U.S. Israel versus Iran issue. And we are very, very happy to be joined here on the show by Sina Toossi, who's a senior non-resident fellow at the Center for International Policy. Sina, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, great to have you here. And I guess my first question is, I'd like you to maybe talk to us about the claim being made by, President Trump that his bombing was a great victory for peace, and that he, of course, has set the stage now for everything in the region to start moving in a positive direction, and is really sort of the great peacemaker now, and will resolve all issues with Iran and perhaps elsewhere.
Yeah, so really for the past several decades, especially in the post 9/11 era, the US and Israel, really the US at the behest of Israel, have been trying to transform the Middle East to make it more safe and secure for Israel over the long term, to change the geopolitical landscape for this new century of American dominance and hegemony. Like if you read the letters by Project for a New American Century before 9/11, this was very clearly enunciated in their goals. And this is, all those people staff the Bush administration. So now I really view this war as a last-ditch desperate attempt, in light of October 7th and everything that's been happening to, Iran was always the main goal, the ultimate goal, to take that out and reshape the strategic landscape. But, I think we can really strongly say that they did not achieve these strategic goals. They had a lot of tactical successes. Their opening surprise attack took out top Iranian military commanders. But Netanyahu explicitly said their main goal is to destroy Iran's nuclear and missile capabilities. They clearly tried to spur regime change as well and destabilize the country. They bombed police stations, they bombed media stations, they bombed, all kinds of infrastructure to kind of instigate chaos. But, we saw Iran was firing missiles at Israel in a very effective way right up until the ceasefire. Steve Bannon said that that contributed to the ceasefire to save Israel. They were also running low on their very expensive interceptors. Trump himself acknowledged the damage Iran did. And, this nuclear program, how much it's been set back is very much in debate. We have both European and American intelligence assessments that have been leaked that say that, Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium and its advanced centrifuges are basically untouched. They've been moved. The damage at Fordo is unclear, and Iran has other, now Iran basically their nuclear program is much more ambiguous and non-transparent, which is actually more advantageous in many ways for Iran.
Let's talk a bit about that because I think it's interesting to now that we can sit back and like kind of reflect on this 12-day war. You had the Israelis coming out, hard, and making these wild statements about their goals. And they weren't vague. I mean, the goals were destroy Iran's nuclear program, and essentially the goal became regime change, right? And we look at the end of this, and they didn't get either of those things. So I'm just curious how you assess winners and losers here. And I don't want to say Iran necessarily won because Iran was horribly bombed, but actually let's look at what was the goal and was it accomplished?
Exactly. Yeah, I think, it helps to really just detail their strategic goals and Iran's strategic goals overall. Their strategic goal, I think Israel's strategic goal in the modern era has been to basically get the US into the region, drag the US to fight wars on its behalf as it pursues this expansionist policy, tries to consolidate this apartheid genocidal system in Israel. And, Israel strongly has opposed US-Iran negotiations. I would argue, based on the worry that America would leave the region or diminish its presence in the region, come to some kind of broader settlement with Iran, and Israel would be left more vulnerable, wouldn't have as much of a free hand. And so, I think that played into Israel's opposition to the Obama era nuclear deal. That's played into their opposition to the talks Trump had. Now, Trump, it seems like, there's different schools of thought whether, Trump's negotiations with Iran these past several months were all a strategic ruse or not, or if Netanyahu kind of played him and then Trump rolled with it because the opening salvo was so effective. Regardless, the outcome is that Iran's nuclear program is not destroyed, the way they're trying to portray it as. Trump, they need the political win. Netanyahu needs the political win. But as we see these assessments, as the picture gets clearer, the most critical aspects of the program, again, the enriched uranium and advanced centrifuges are intact. Iran's missile program was not destroyed. They showed their capabilities, and I'm sure they're going to double down on investing in those capabilities. And the broader strategic picture is that, America, I think when push came to shove, Trump wrapped up the war. As soon as America was getting drawn into this, American bases, the stability of these Persian Gulf allies of America was questioned. They pulled out, and I think this could, well, they're going to try to capitalize on this. We'll see, with the Gaza, with what's going on in Gaza and whatnot. But I think the broader strategic outcome could be, we'll see how it plays out, that if America comes, is again pursuing negotiations with Iran, seeks some kind of settlement, doesn't want to get involved in a war, pushes Israel to end the war in Gaza because of its own consequences for America's own strategic interests for this kind of ruling elite in America. And that could end up putting Israel in a strategically more weaker position, especially given that Iran's nuclear program is not destroyed, and especially given that they basically have this nuclear ambiguity right now, not unlike Israel's nuclear program.
I feel one of the aspects of this, and certainly the lead up and the way that this was, justified by the Trump administration, by Israel and others, is that, somehow Iran doesn't want to negotiate, that the negotiations are just a ruse. I mean, despite the fact that we already had a deal, despite the fact that there have been a lot of negotiations, that, you can't really negotiate with Iran. And I wonder how you evaluate that, because that feels like an important sort of almost implied reality, especially in the US media, about how this is discussed, which, at least to me, doesn't really seem to be borne out by what has taken place over the last 10 years.
Yeah, I think, that narrative is really testament to, the lopsided nature of not just power in the current international system, which is changing, but also the information war, and that's why it's so important what you guys are doing. Like this media land, is the media hegemony is what needs to be challenged and changed. But yeah, so I mean, the idea that Iran was not at the negotiating table, or has not been a sincere negotiator in the past is blatantly false. That the opposite is actually true. That America was the one under Trump who left the previous nuclear deal. That these Iran and Trump just were in the midst of negotiations, spurred on by Trump, who positioned himself as an anti-war candidate, who consistently said he was adamant about getting a deal with Iran. He wrote a letter to Iran's supreme leader Khamenei in March, basically begging for negotiations. I mean, apparently, according to US sources, it was very respectful. It was even talking about respecting Iran's nuclear infrastructure and all that, like the Iranian bottom line. And they had 5 rounds of negotiations. After each round, both US and Iranian negotiators were kind of upbeat. They said they were forward leaning. And then there was a 6th round scheduled last Sunday. And it seemed like they might actually reach a preliminary kind of interim deal, like a framework deal based on principles. And then Israel launches attack. It seemed like Israel went to Trump, told them a narrative that, we have this all prepared. We're going to take them out. It's going to be easy. This is going to help you get Iranian capitulation. We're going to spur, even regime change potentially. Trump did give some kind of green light. They said you gave the 60-day deadline, which is unclear when that even started. This is going to make you look tough, blah, blah, blah. And Trump seemingly bought that, rolled with it. That Friday morning, he was very upbeat. He said it was excellent. And then he went silent for a couple days, and then his tune changed. The second Iranian missile strikes came, the second the Iranian public rallied around the defense of their country, there was no signs of any kind of turmoil, unrest, regime change developments. And it was clear that this was going to become a quagmire. And, they went into crisis mode and ended it in 12 days. And it's unclear what conditions there were for ending it, because Trump said at NATO that China can now buy Iranian oil. That's huge. I mean, China's been explicitly sanctioned for buying Iranian oil. Was that a condition of ending the war from the Iranians? Or Trump said that at the NATO summit that because of the ceasefire between Iran and Israel, great progress was being made on ending the Gaza war. Was that an Iranian condition? Again, I'm not saying it was, but interesting that he's saying that. And now, again, they're pursuing negotiations. CNN just reported that they're offering Iran massive sanctions relief, $30 billion of their frozen assets, other stuff. And in a context where the US claims Iran's nuclear infrastructure is destroyed, Iran is expelling IAEA inspectors and saying, just going totally kind of in this ambiguous, silent direction, non-transparent direction with the nuclear program. And if the US is now pursuing negotiations to lift sanctions, that changes the strategic picture, I would argue, more in favor of Iran than vice versa.
Sina, I want to ask you a bit about the Iranian diaspora, because I know that Nyack just put out this poll of some Iranian American views that are quite interesting, and I say that also because I watch a lot of CNN, especially because I hate myself, and especially the last 12, couple of weeks, I was kind of like flipping through the different mainstream channels like a crazy person, just watching how they were covering it. And it was always, there were some good people on, I'll give it that. Like you had the Valley Nasser types, and I mean, he's got good analysis and he's very realistic. But you also had people like Kareem Sajadpour, who is at the Carnegie. He's their a chief Iran analyst. And I mean, I think I just saw him like earlier today on CNN saying that basically like the Iranian regime is so weak and is like basically like could collapse like that. I thought it was kind of funny. He was talking about the supreme leader being really old, like that's like unique to Iran, and I'm just kind of like, our president is 79, but okay. Anyway, all that's to say, if you watch a lot of mainstream media, you do get this view that like, not that necessarily that most Iranian Americans like support the destruction of Iran with Israeli bombs, not necessarily that, but that like a lot of Iranian Americans would actually be pretty happy if the U.S. got its way in Iran. So I'm curious if you could talk a bit about what actually the Iranian American attitude is when it comes to this sort of stuff. And I also want to note that this is happening as we're watching Iranian immigrants in the U.S. like get swept up and basically detained by ICE for no reason other than being Iranian.
Yeah, I think, the context is important when trying to measure sentiment of Iranian Americans or Iranians in Iran. One context is that, for over 4 decades, on top of the various regime change efforts that the US and its allies have undertaken against Iran, there's been an all-out media war, an empire of propaganda. It's very understudied, like how many media stations and media outlets and websites and well-funded news stations there are targeting the Iranian population in Farsi to basically gaslight people. I mean, we talked about the in this country, it was talked about the Russian disinformation campaigns that's, people blamed for people voting for Trump. Okay, that they were misled, whatever. But we're talking about disinformation campaigns. The disinformation campaigns targeting Iranians is unprecedented in modern times. So whatever sentiment has been generated in that regard, I would argue is largely in the regard of supporting attacks on Iran from some Iranians in the diaspora is more an outcome of these disinformation campaigns. But what this war, I think, proved once and for all, and I think people like Karim Satchoupur further discredit themselves by pushing this narrative of like, oh, it just takes another small push. Like they just did a massive push and nothing happened. So what do you want? He knows really nothing about the situation in Iran. He's another one of these kind of very shallow Iran analysts in DC that just perpetuate what the hawks want to hear. And he adds the Iranian face to this destructive agenda, which these people need as well. But yeah, I mean, in general, when the reality came and bombs started dropping and Iranian kids started dying, that the vast majority of the Iranian public and the diaspora are obviously opposed to that. Regardless of whatever, legitimate qualms they have with their government and the Islamic Republic and whatnot, that we saw. I was even struck by how much of a rally around the nation there was and rally around the defense of Iran. And, from secular to religious, from women who wear the hijab, who don't wear the hijab, from Gen Z, from across the board, So you have this whole kind of cottage industry, well-funded echo chamber of these people who've been propped up, and it's like you have a minority of people. They give them the biggest loudspeaker in the world. They give them Iran International that ran a $500 million budget deficit in the past couple of years, and then you make these people seem like they're the people of Iran. And then but it's like it's this cycle of propaganda, and they're fooling, like the American and Israeli decision makers are fooling themselves because they created a cycle of propaganda, of this propaganda machine that told them what they want to hear. Apparently, based on their own propaganda, they made these foolish decisions to like, oh, the people are going to rise up. This is going to be easy, one final push. And then they were embarrassed. Nothing happened. They had to pull back. And so if they continue to believe their own propaganda, they're shooting themselves in the foot. It's self-defeating.
Well, we appreciate you helping us sort through all of this. Sina Toossi, Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Center for International Policy. Thanks so much for joining us here in the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me.